So good afternoon. I'm Betty Reynolds, President of Oregon School Boards Association.
How's the recording going?
So good afternoon. I'm Betty Reynolds, President of Oregon School Boards Association. And thank you so much for your interest in OSBA's state funding survey. Given the state's $1.6 billion budget shortfall, this survey provides timely information to lawmakers here in Salem. It also demonstrates the commitment of Oregonians to public education and their willingness to tackle the tough issues that are going to be necessary to assure that all students receive the education they deserve. We believe that the new survey provides a starting point for lawmakers to tackle the tough issue of revenue reform, and it's our hope that legislators can come together with other decision makers and our partners in addressing the budget issues that are necessary to assure that our K-12 education, our public schools, are the best that they can be so that all students receive the education they deserve. So with us today, in addition to school board members statewide from around the state, is John Horvick, who's the Vice President and Political Director for DHM Research. He's available to answer technical questions. And I'd like to introduce Jim Green, OSBA's Executive Director, to talk about the survey results and their implications. Jim?
Thanks, Betty. Good afternoon. My name is Jim Green, and I'm the Executive Director at the Oregon School Boards Association. OSBA began about a year and a half ago undertaking a task at looking at revenue reform for the state of Oregon, specifically how to fund K-12 schools. And I want to thank the school board members and administrators that are in the room today for their backing of this program and going forward with what we knew we had to do for boys and girls. We hired DHM Research. John Hovick is here to talk technically about the poll, but we did a poll of 600 registered voters in the state of Oregon. About 59% were landlines and about 41% were cell phones. I think in today's world, we all know we need to get a good cross mix of that data. And what it showed, I think some high takeaways from what it showed, is that Oregonians support very strongly public K-12 schools in the state of Oregon. 93% of our respondents said that they support public schools, and 73% of them said they strongly support public schools in the state of Oregon. They also said the most important thing the legislature can do is adequately fund K-12 schools. When asked that question, it was far and above the number one thing the legislature can do in order to move schools forward and do what we need to do for boys and girls in the state of Oregon. So one of the things I've been asked by legislators as I talk to them about this poll and some of the data is, well, Jim, what's it show? What can we do? What can we move forward on? And I think Oregonians are a discerning lot, this poll shows. It still shows that they do not support ballot measure 97 as it was proposed this last fall. You'll be all shocked to know that they don't support a sales tax either, even with all the sideboards on it that you could possibly put dedicated to K-12 schools, can't raise it without a vote of the people, and no local add-on. We still only cracked 35% in the state of Oregon. So I think that resoundingly says to legislators, a sales tax for Oregonians is not the way to go. So what does it show? It does show that Oregonians support their K-12 schools and that they believe it needs additional funding. How they fund those schools is very particular with regard to how this poll moved forward. What it showed was Oregonians want the legislature to increase taxes on large businesses, somewhat like 97, but a little different in that they want to tax income. They want it differentiated amongst industries, and they do not want the legislature to have discretion with the dollars. They want it dedicated to K-12 education. 65% of those polled said they would support a measure like ballot measure 97 with some of the issues that I've addressed if it were dedicated to K-12 schools. The other thing this poll shows is while they're willing to do that, Oregonians also want some things on the other side of the ledger sheet. They do want some spending controls and some controls on expenditures from across the state. Specifically, we didn't ask those, but I think you all know at the top of everybody's mind is some sort of PERS reform, as well as some cost containment in health care across the state as well. What the poll did show is that Oregonians are willing to take a tax vote, to increase taxes on large businesses as long as it's dedicated to K-12 schools. And I think that provides a path forward for this legislature when they look at the budget issue that Betty spoke about at $1.6 or $1.8 billion. This provides that path forward for this legislature to come together and begin the discussion. And I think we're already in the middle of March. They go till July 10th. They need to begin these discussions now rather than later. Because as we across school districts begin to build our budgets and we hear numbers to the state school fund like $7.8 billion or $8.1 billion, we all know as school managers across the state, that is in fact a reduction to the services we're going to provide to boys and girls. So we believe it is imperative for the legislative leadership and the 90 folks that sit here in the Capitol to move forward with a plan to increase revenue that's dedicated to K-12 schools and moves us forward to meeting the quality education model as we begin this process of going forward in the state of Oregon. We did ask voters what they thought about the quality education model, and 66% of them said they support the legislature bringing the quality education model to fruition. That's about a $2 billion increase, and Oregonians recognize that, but they said that's not a bridge too far to go to because it does provide the quality education we need for boys and girls in the state of Oregon. I do want to thank the school board members and our board of directors at OSBA who put forth the funds and the dedication necessary to ask Oregonians what they think. These type of things are not light undertakings, and I believe, as Betty mentioned earlier, this provides that roadmap for where this legislature can go to improve our funding situation for the boys and girls in this state. We believe it is imperative that they begin those discussions today. As I said, school districts are currently building their budgets, and if we have to lay teachers off, we have to give them adequate notice. And the worst thing you can do is provide notice to someone that they don't have a job and then flip-flop to bring them back because they may already have a job somewhere else. We need to keep the best and the brightest workforce we can in front of our children, and that only happens with stable funding moving forward at the state level. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Are you aware of any ballot measures that could come out of this? I know this was done to kind of help lawmakers in policy making, but I know one of the results was that voters would support eliminating the kicker, personal income kicker, if it were dedicated to education as well. Are there any groups that are looking at a ballot measure that would do that?
I think there are a variety of folks throughout the Capitol looking at a variety of ballot measures that may pass muster with the voters. One of those could be with regard to the kicker, and you mentioned the poll results. We did test the kicker, the personal kicker, and about 66%, John, 66% of voters said that they were willing to have the personal kicker kept by the state if it went into a rainy day fund for K-12 education. That just shows another step by voters saying they recognize the problems that we have in funding our schools and they're willing to do anything they can in order to help it out. We don't have a specific measure to do that, but there are plenty of them floating around the building that could have that come to fruition. Again, that does take a constitutional vote, so it does require a vote of the people. So you would either have to see a referral out of the legislature or some sort of ballot measure brought forward.
On the percentage of folks who are willing to go there for large businesses, it wasn't a huge number. I've seen polls with much higher, over 60%. This was in the low 50s, I believe. Is that a soft number from your perspective? Would you have liked to have seen that a little bit higher in terms of a path that people can get behind in this building?
Well, obviously, we'd like to see 100% of Oregonians say that. I don't think it's soft in comparison to what we just went through with Ballot Measure 97. Ballot Measure 97 was a brutal campaign that pitted social services and kids against large corporations. And Oregonians thought it was a bridge too far to raise $6 billion without having any of it dedicated to one particular funding area. I think Oregonians understand the problem that they see with regard to funding in K-12, and they're willing to move forward. That number may be a little bit soft, but I think there's a couple of things that may lend to that. That campaign that just happened with Ballot Measure 97, I think was probably the most divisive campaign I've seen in a long time in Oregon. And I think number two, Voters are right now doing their taxes. They're looking at how much they're going to pay in taxes. And what they said was, our personal taxes are about right for what we're paying. Small to medium-sized businesses are about right, and large businesses ought to pay more. So I think there's a couple of things that lend it to look like a soft number, but I think it's well over 50%, and that's something that you have to pay attention to if you're sitting in this building wondering what Oregonians want.
Jim, I apologize for being late. My question is, as far as taxing businesses pay taxes in a variety of ways. Personal property tax on their equipment, excise taxes sometimes, income taxes sometimes, and then you could argue indirectly through what they pay their employees and
Sure.
the employees pay them. Was there any discussion in the way the questions were worded as to how businesses pay taxes? Because when people say businesses should pay their fair share,
There were, and I'd like to bring John up to answer that question. There were some questions about how do businesses pay taxes, and John's really our expert on those questions.
Sure. Well, John Horvick with DHM Research. The thing you have to understand about Oregonians and sort of impressions of any tax system is we don't know a lot. The system is complicated. We asked in the survey to name a primary source of state revenue, and I think corporate taxes or business taxes were certainly in the single digits, with a plurality, I think, of people saying that they don't know. So some of it is there's the technical aspects which you're bringing up, and the Oregonians may or may not know that. But it's probably more so an expression of values. Who do they think is doing well in their communities in the state, and therefore who should be paying? So I would look at it both as the way you're asking, but also just as a value statement. Where do Oregonians stand on the issue?
Yes.
Is this the first time you guys have commissioned a study like this?
It's the first time the Oregon School Boards Association has standalone looking at a survey like this. We have joined with other entities in the past to look at some property tax reform. That polling wasn't so good. That was several years ago. So we may have to ask some property tax questions, but we have joined with other entities throughout our existence. This is the first time OSBA stood alone. And we believe as school board members that are locally elected, it's our responsibility to do that on behalf of the boys and girls, to show our other elected leaders here in the legislature there is a path forward, that we as locally elected school board members will stand behind you in getting this over the finish line for our boys and girls. The time to act is clearly now. We have to do this biennium. We cannot wait any longer. Our fourth graders are only in fourth grade for 1 year. Our juniors are only juniors for 1 year, and then they're going to exit our system next year. And to be honest with you, we as a state have not done a good job in providing education to them, and definitely a quality education at the funding level we all know we need to make that happen. What this poll shows is that Oregonians are willing to step up to the plate and have that tough discussion about taxes, about spending issues, and where we go as a state going forward. But I think it's clear from the numbers that we see, Oregonians support public K-12 education, and they want the best system they can have for their boys and girls, and they're willing to pay for it. Yes?
From what you've seen so far this session, do you feel like lawmakers have that same willingness to have this tough discussion?
I think this helps them have that discussion. I don't think without some adequate data, and that's why we did this, was to provide data to our elected leaders here in the Capitol of what is possible going forward. I think those discussions are beginning, and I think they should begin in earnest now. As I said, we're in the middle of March. School districts are building their budgets. If we don't have an adequate number to fund the state school fund, then we'll be sending out pink slips, we'll be cutting programs, we'll be increasing our class sizes, and that also showed in the poll, this is not something that Oregonians want. They are willing to tax more in order to avoid teacher layoffs and increases in class sizes. It's just that important. Oregonians, parents, taxpayers, grandparents across this state get it. And they're kind of done with the excuses that have been coming out of this building for many bienniums. They believe now's the time, that this is a perfect opportunity for this legislature to step forward and take a look at an issue that has been growing and growing for decades in our state and needs to be fixed.
How will you apply that pressure? I mean, I've heard lawmakers, and the governor has even said that potentially waiting till 2018 and running another ballot measure is perhaps a good path, or the path they would prefer. What's your pushback on that? I mean, beyond what you said now.
How many times are we going to let a fourth grader be a fourth grader? How many times are we going to let a sixth grader be a sixth grader? How long are we going to let what we're doing to boys and girls in this state go forward? It's unconscionable. It's irresponsible, and it's time to move forward on this debate. This gives them a path forward for that, and they can act now. This poll shows that Oregonians are willing to move forward now, so long as it improves public K-12 education. And they want to see graduation rates increase. They want to see our dropouts decrease. They want to see an elimination of that opportunity gap. And those are things that we as school board members hold near and dear to our heart and will be held accountable for. It's time for the state to move forward. It's just that plain and simple. We've waited too long. Our kids have suffered, our economy has suffered, and we need to move forward.
Jim, one of the things that has come up in the legislature is that business income taxes are passé, that it's better to go with gross receipts or whatever you call it. How does that factor into what your poll suggests?
Our poll showed that, in fact, the gross receipts tax, like a ballot measure 97, wouldn't pass muster. They want to take a look at income, although we have an income on our corporations and our large businesses. They want to take a look at that. They want to see it differentiated, as I said before, amongst and between businesses. I think if we were to rerun a ballot measure 97, even at a smaller amount, if it wasn't dedicated to K-12 education, it would be very hard to pass in this state. Now, admittedly, the legislature can act on its own with regard to some of these without having to refer it to a vote. I think you would see a referral either through the referendum process or the legislature referring a measure out. But in either case, I don't think Oregonians are ready to vote on ballot measure 97 again. Dick, you only get so many shots with voters in Oregon, and pretty soon they'll get ballot fatigue of these issues keep coming up and keep being brought forward. They support public K-12 education, but at some point they're going to say, legislature, it's your time to fix this. That's what we elected you to do, and we've shown them a path forward.
Do they trust the legislature?
I would say that that's a question that needs to be more in-depthly studied, Dick. But when you say they only support additional funding if it's dedicated, to me that says they don't trust the legislature all the way. But they are their elected leaders. They're the folks who they put in place to make these decisions. And as I said before, I think all these school board members in the room believe it's time for these folks to make these decisions now, rather than wait for a special session or wait till 2018 or wait for our fourth graders to become high schoolers who are behind the eight ball when it comes to where we're at with educational quality for our boys and girls.
On the poll, you referenced this earlier, but it actually showed more people, and obviously that's usually what they say, they prefer to decrease spending versus increase their taxes. And you said you made the conscious choice not to ask them how they might decrease spending. Why? Can you walk us through? That seems like if that's where voters would like people to look first, we should also be asking about where spending should be going.
Well, I think we should ask about that, but when we worked with our associates at DHM, we already had a long poll. This poll took 23 minutes for an individual to answer on the phone. That's a long time to stay on the phone and answer these questions. But I think our partners at DHM found that Oregonians are very concerned about what's going on with regard to the budget, with regard to school funding, with regard to housing and low income. I mean, there are a variety of issues being dealt with. And if we were to ask specifics on what you would cut, you could spend another 23 minutes going through the various parts of the budget. We know that there are the three largest parts of the budget that they look at: education funding, human services, and crime and corrections. With regard to other parts of the budget, there's not a lot left over for them to take a look at. But I think first and foremost on folks' mind, we saw was with regard to PERS. It pulled up into the higher numbers with regard to what can the legislature do, and looking at some health insurance curtailments as well.
The legislature is sort of looking at nickel and diming and on some revenue increases through mortgage interest deduction, property taxes. Some ideas have been said are now dead: a tax on older cars, a tax on coffee, and things like that. Does this poll provide any information for legislators looking in other areas for all the money they can find wherever it might be?
I think it does provide some information for where the legislature could go for tax increases. Those are tough votes. So are votes to decrease spending. Let's not make this an easy task for the legislature to deal with. Increasing taxes and cutting spending in programs are difficult, very difficult choices. These are choices school board members have made every year, by the way, in their funding scenarios for decades now in the state of Oregon. What are we going to cut? What are we not going to buy? Which teacher gets laid off? And I can tell you what I hear from our membership across the state, Dick, is they're tired of it. They don't want to have to make those choices anymore. They want to make the best choices they can for boys and girls. And what it shows to the legislature is it is time for them to move forward so that school board members can do their work that they know are the best things for boys and girls. Not wait around any longer for the legislature to come up with nickel and dime packages that really, really, really do not move us forward in our revenue issues within the state of Oregon.
One last question from me. Every poll that I've seen through the decades here says that Oregonians support education. Is there something different about this one?
I think this one's different in that it says they are willing to increase taxes on certain parts of our economy in order to fund K-12 education. We specifically asked that question. What is it and who is it you'd like to see taxed in order to help this process along? They believe large businesses. They believe personally they're paying about enough. Medium to small size businesses are paying enough, but large businesses ought to pay more of their fair share in order to make this occur. I think you still have to look at the vote in ballot measure 97, though. $6 billion with unfettered control to the legislature was a bridge too far for voters to go. I think they're willing to look at a tax package that's dedicated to K-12 education, but doesn't get into the $6 billion range. But if you could get into the $2 to $3 billion range dedicated to education, that moves us along significantly of the continuum to get us to the quality education model, which is a goal we voted in back in 2001 as Oregonians, but yet we've never stepped up to the plate and paid for it. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.